Hello and welcome to another video. So today I would like to hop on the train in which we are talking about Linus Tech Tips and Linus Sebastian's misadventures in Linux, in which he managed to nuke his pub !_OS install in about an hour after installing it, based on a very serious bug that was in the system. And so I wanted to discuss about, because seeing how these people at LTT, the Linus Tech Tips channel, are trying out Linux is kind of can be misleading for the general public without understanding what actually Linux is. And I think it is a good opportunity for us to just take a look at it. So technically speaking, of course, Linux is by the narrow definition is a kernel that is a very important part of the operating system, but it's not the only part of the operating system, of course. But the kernel is this part which defines how your computer is executing programs. I guess this is kind of the simple way I can explain it. So it's handling the hardware, so your software can run on the hardware the way it is useful, I would say. And so of course that is barely enough for a computer to be useful. So in modern Linux-based operating systems we have a lot of other components over the kernel, and these are the so-called Linux distributions, are distributing the kernel with all these other programs that make your operating system useful. And a lot of Linux distributions will also distribute third-party software with them. So like your word processor, your calendar, your web browser, they all can be included in your system and will be distributed by your operating system distributor, which is a kind of a convenient thing. And so because a lot of people who are using computers are used to operating systems like Microsoft Windows or Apple's different operating systems, or maybe even Android if we are talking about smartphones, those are kind of very different in another way from Linux, because not just from, they're of course very different in a technical perspective. Like for example, Microsoft Windows is very different in how the software interacts with your hardware than Linux, but it's also very different based on how the operating system itself is written and maintained. And so a lot of people of course have reservations about Linux, and people talk about this big fragmentation because we have like Ubuntu and Debian and Arch Linux and Gentoo and Fedora and all these distributions. And so people, when they want to try out Linux, they don't know which one they should try. And this was kind of one of the points that Linus Sebastian made in his video, that how the hell do I decide which one should I use? And of course this is not an easy question, but this we have to understand what Linux is to be able to understand why this is happening and why this is actually a good thing. So when we are looking at an operating system like Microsoft Windows, that is made by, you guessed it, Microsoft, this large company which is basically employing many people, and they earn a lot of money by creating software that doesn't really respect their users. So I don't know, have you ever read the end user license agreement of Microsoft Windows when you installed it on your computer? I haven't. So they wrote this very long legal document that just restricts you as a user. So you just pay money to use that software, but you cannot even own anything about it. This software restricts you on how you use your computer, and it restricts you to what you can know about. So it's not just tells you what you can and cannot do with Microsoft Windows, it also tells you that you are not allowed to understand what Microsoft Windows does on your computer. And it's very similar with other operating systems written by a large corporation who just do everything. While in Linux, the beauty of this system is that you have the kernel, which is written by the Linux kernel developers, and they are funded by big corporations, because of course a lot of corporations use Linux and they want the kernel to be able to do the things that they need to do in their businesses, so they will give money to these developers, so they make Linux. They are ensured that Linux is continuously updated and it's maintained, the code base is maintained and things like that. And so, of course, we cannot say that Linux does not have anything corporate in it, but the way the operating systems are made is not that there is like this big corporation that is making it so it can sell the licenses for as much as possible. It is made by small groups, and the Linux kernel group is just one part who are working on the operating system. There are, of course, a lot of other components of the operating system, such as, for example, your init system, and you can have many different init systems, but the most popular one, which is an init system and does a lot of other things, systemd, that's, for example, mostly developed by people at Red Hat, which is a different corporation. And then you will have all these different graphical environments which you can put on top of it. So you could use a very simple graphical environment which will just divide your screen into rectangles where your programs will be, or you can have full desktop environments which are similar to Windows or similar to macOS, or you could have even very different concepts because the system is modular. So it's not just one corporation that decides from bottom to of the kernel to the top, like the user interface solutions. Everything will be decided by the same group. You can just build your system up from different components, and of course there will be Linux distributions where they pre-select which components you should be using, and they will customize it for you, like the pop !_OS is that type of Linux-based operating system. Or you could have ones where some of the parts are generally pre-selected for you. For example, on Arch Linux you use the Pacman package manager and you use the systemd as the init system, but on top of that there are not really many restrictions of how you build up your own system. And so this is very different from Windows, and before you start complaining about that, you have to understand this. And this is kind of one of the, once you understand how the system is made up of all these separate components which are all developed and maintained by other groups, once you understand that, now you know what you expect when you are using this system. So you cannot expect that everything will adhere to the same kind of philosophy, because they might be written by different people, by different groups, they are developed separately. So if you want a consistent approach, a consistent environment, or a consistent experience, then you should choose a distribution where everything is kind of customized in the same degree or to the same kind of approach. And there are those types of operating systems based on Linux, of course, but of course if you are like me, you can just always pick and choose the best tools and just accept that sometimes, they will behave a little differently from each other. And what else? Yeah, if we understand this one, let's just talk about the licensing, of course, because I already bashed Microsoft for licensing Windows under these very restrictive terms. So why should you use Linux if it's just like very complicated? A lot of different people are using it, so you don't really have a consistency. A lot of people building it from different blocks, so it's weird, and it can be difficult to put these things together. And because of this highly modular nature, even the big distributions can contain bugs, like what Linus Sebastian ran into that nuked his system when he tried to install Steam. Why would we even bother using Linux? And well, why we should be bothered to at least try is because of the licensing. So the Linux kernel itself is licensed under a so-called copyleft license, which gives you all the freedom. So you have zero restrictions on what you can do with your computer, and you also are permitted to take a look and analyze how your system works. So this is why the source code is always available for Linux, because it's licensed under a model where you, the user, have every right to know every little thing your system is doing, your software is doing with your computer. And that is like living in a house where you are not allowed to check behind, what should I call, the cover of a lamp. So you don't know if your landlord is having cameras on you. You don't know if your landlord is watching your electricity consumption, maybe even, you know, maybe if they are wiretapping your phone calls and your internet stuff, you are not allowed to take a look. In Linux, it's like your own house. When once it's built up, every time you want to change something, you are allowed to check the wiring, you are allowed to change out the kitchen sink if you don't like it. It gives you not just the opportunity to check what it's doing, but the flexibility to change its behavior. And even if you personally cannot do that, it just grants you that there will be someone who can and who will, and you can maybe find those people and you know, find what they did and utilize that, because it's copyleft. So once you are using, you can use it and modify it, and you can give it to other people once you modified it. But you are forced to always keep the same restrictionless licensing under Linux, under the license Linux is licensed under. So you can modify it, you can change it, you can redistribute it, but you also have to let the other people know what they are doing, and they can also, you know, work on top of that, which is very great for an operating system that you are using on your home computer. So if we are trying to figure out if we should be using Linux or Windows or Mac OS, this is the important question I think we should ask. Not which one looks better, which one is faster, but whether is it important for me that my computer is doing the stuff I tell it to do, and I have all the power to check whether it is really doing what I have to do, or am I okay with an operating system that even can spy on me without ever notifying me? It can give away all my information to anyone, and I'm not allowed, legally not allowed to check that. So I think this is the approach we have to take when we decide, do we use Linux or not. I think even if Linux was slower, looked worse than Windows, I think that just because of the licensing, it is still the better choice. But you know, nowadays you can do everything on Linux that you can do on Windows. Conditions apply. They might not be like the same way. They do them the same way. You don't, you know, it's not maybe not as easy. Maybe some things more difficult, some things more simple. But the thing is, when you choose your new operating system, you will always have to learn how to do things on that. So even if you would switch from Windows to Mac OS, you would have to relearn a lot of things. So why don't you just switch to one that actually respects you as the user and doesn't just exploit you for your money? See you next time. The birds are having a good time today. Or maybe they are having a bad time and complaining about it. I don't know.